At 19, Amara Jackson was traded for a horse. She stood on the dusty ground, a silent witness to her own sale, and overheard the words that sealed her fate. She's worth less than that stallion. The handshake between her uncle and the giant rancher felt like a gavel coming down on her life. In the whispers that drifted on the Oklahoma wind, she was already a ghost, another broken soul destined for a life of hard labor, or worse, under the shadow of the mountains. Everyone in the territory knew what this meant. They thought the reclusive man, Jedediah Wyatt, had bought himself a servant, someone to cook his meals, clean his house, and warm his bed through the long, lonely nights. But Jedediah Wyatt was a man drowning in secrets. His debts weren't measured in money but in blood. His enemies weren't just rivals. They were men who traded human lives like cattle across three territories. And this lonely ranch was more than just a home. It was a battleground. What no one understood, not Amara, not her uncle, and not even the giant who now owned her, was that this simple, brutal transaction had just lit a fuse. It placed them both at the dead center of a conspiracy so vast, it could either free every family from Oklahoma to Kansas or bury them all. This desperate deal, meant to save one small farm, was about to become the key that could shatter an entire empire of corruption. The morning sun cast long, skeletal shadows as Amara swept the floor of the one-room schoolhouse. It was the only place she'd ever felt free. Her students were long gone, their laughter a fading echo, but she stayed behind as she always did, running her fingers over the few precious books the missionaries had left. At 19, she had a skill more valuable than gold in these parts. She could read and write as well as any man from the East. That's when she heard the hoofbeats, a slow, heavy rhythm that spoke of a terrible burden. Through the grimy window, she saw her Uncle Samuel swing down from his horse. He moved like an old man, though he was not yet 40. The lines on his face told a story of years lived in just a few agonizing months. He walked into the schoolhouse and the air grew thick and heavy. He wouldn't meet her eyes. He just stood there, twisting his worn hat in his hands, the silence stretching between them like a hangman's rope. Amara put down her broom. She knew that look. It was the same hollowed-out expression he'd worn the day they buried her parents. It was the look that came just before your world fell apart. Finally, he spoke. His voice was a dry whisper, a rustle of dead leaves. Harlan Granger. The name was a curse in their part of the territory. The debt collector had come calling again, and his terms had changed. They had gone from impossible to unthinkable. The farm, the livestock, the very clothes from their backs. None of it was enough anymore. Granger wanted something else. Amara felt the blood drain from her face. She knew. Of course, she knew. She'd heard the whispers, the chilling stories of other families, other girls who had simply disappeared, swallowed whole by Granger's web of debt and depraved demands. Girls who were never seen again. Her uncle's voice cracked as he explained the one desperate option he had left. A reclusive rancher named Jedediah Wyatt. The man owned a prize stallion, a magnificent animal worth enough to buy them time, maybe even buy their freedom from Granger's iron grip. But Wyatt wasn't interested in money. Amara's hands shook, her knuckles turning white as she gripped the edge of a wooden desk. Now she understood why Samuel couldn't look at her. The rancher didn't want money, he wanted a person. He wanted to fill the vast, empty silence of his isolated life. He wanted her. The next morning, the wagon was hitched. The journey to the Wyatt property was a silent funeral procession for the life Amara had known. Every turn of the wheels took her further from the schoolhouse, from her books, from herself. The familiar landscape became alien, hostile. She watched the schoolhouse shrink in the distance until it was just a speck, and then it was gone. Other travelers on the road didn't need to ask. They knew. Word traveled like wildfire in the territory. Their eyes held a sickening mix of pity and disgust. Pity for her, disgust for a world that allowed a woman to be sold like livestock. They stopped for supplies at the general store, and the proprietor's wife made no effort to lower her voice. Such a shame, she clucked, shaking her head. That educated girl deserved better than being property for some hermit. Amara's chin shot up. She walked past the woman, her back straight as a rifle barrel, refusing to give them the satisfaction of her tears. She would not break. not in front of them. The Wyatt Ranch appeared on the horizon, not as a farm, but as a fortress. The buildings were huge, sprawling across acres of land, more prosperous than anything she could have imagined. This was no simple ranch. This was an empire. Jedediah Wyatt himself emerged from the main house. He was a giant, taller than any man she'd ever seen, with shoulders that could block out the sun. His face was a mask of stone, his eyes unreadable as he watched them approach. Her uncle Samuel climbed down from the wagon, his body stiff with fear and shame. Amara stayed put, watching the two men, the giant who held her future, and the uncle who had just sold it. The negotiation was brutally short, less than 10 minutes. Wyatt's voice was low and measured, carrying across the yard with an unnerving calm. He asked few questions. He made almost no demands. The terms were terrifyingly simple. Amara would manage the household. She would assist with ranch operations. That was it. There was no mention of the things that made her stomach clench in knots. No talk of sleeping arrangements. No discussion of the other duties she was expected to perform. The vagueness was somehow worse than a direct command. Samuel came back to the wagon and took her single bag. His hands trembled as he helped her down. For one long, terrible moment, they just looked at each other. Uncle and niece, seller and sold. They both knew it was the last time they would ever see each other. Nearby, the stallion was tethered. Its coat shone like polished jet in the sun. The magnificent animal, that was her price. She looked at the horse, then back at the men. She was worth less. Without another word, Samuel climbed back onto his wagon. The creak of the wheels was the sound of her past driving away forever, leaving her alone in the dust with a stranger who now owned her, body and soul. Wyatt studied her. His dark eyes seemed to peer right through her, seeing every fear she tried to hide. He said nothing. He simply picked up her bag and turned toward the house. Amara followed, each step a surrender. But the inside of the house was not what she expected. It was a shock that jolted her to the core. Books. Not just a few books, but hundreds. Thousands. They lined shelves that reached to the high ceilings. The furniture was fine, elegant. The air smelled of leather and old paper, not dirt and sweat. This was not the den of a brute. It was the home of a scholar. Wyatt set her bag down. He turned to face her. The silence in the room was absolute. His next words would define her new reality. They would tell her if her life was to be one of cruelty or something else, something she hadn't even dared to hope for. In the afternoon light, dust motes danced between them like tiny lost souls, and in that one suspended moment, Amara knew her real story, the one that would be whispered about for years to come, was only just beginning. Jedediah gestured to a chair by the fireplace, a comfortable-looking chair. Amara didn't move. Her body was a tightly wound spring of terror and defiance. Every nerve screamed at her to be ready for the inevitable demand, the one that would shatter the last piece of her dignity. Instead, he offered her tea. The words were so simple, so absurdly normal, that they confused her more than a threat ever could. She took the cup, her hands shaking so badly the porcelain rattled. She stared at his face, searching for the trick, the hidden meaning. Men like Granger didn't offer you tea before they took what they wanted. He explained her living situation in the same flat, motionless tone. A room of her own, on the second floor, and the door had a lock. She could use it, he said, whenever she wished. Amara nearly dropped the cup. This was a game. It had to be. A cruel, elaborate trick to make her lower her guard before the real horror began. No man bought a woman and gave her a lock. He led her upstairs. The room was spacious, clean, a proper bed with fresh linens. A writing desk sat under a window that looked out over the endless green pastures. It felt like a guest room, not a cage. She turned the key in the lock. It made a solid, satisfying click. That first night's sleep was impossible. She lay in the dark, her ears straining, listening for footsteps in the hall, for the rattle of her doorknob. But the only sounds were the distant lowing of cattle and the mournful whisper of the prairie wind. Morning brought another shock. Jedediah was in the kitchen, cooking breakfast himself. He set a place for her at the table, then sat and ate in silence, reading a stack of letters, treating her as if she were nothing more than a new piece of furniture. a quiet, unremarkable part of his daily routine. After the meal, he took her on a tour of the ranch. The sheer scale of it was staggering. It stretched further than the eye could see. Dozens of ranch hands were at work, tending to the cattle, mending fences. When Jedediah introduced her, they simply nodded, respectfully. There was no sneering, no leering, none of the contempt she had braced herself for. But it was the library that stopped her breath. Floor to ceiling, wall to wall, books, literature, philosophy, science, law. It was a treasure trove that made the missionary school's collection look like a child's primer. Her fingers, stained with the ink of her own secret studies, traced the leather spines with a reverence that was almost painful. Jedediah saw it. He saw the hunger in her eyes. "You're welcome to read anything you like," he said, his voice casual, as if he were commenting on the weather. The generosity felt like another trap, another piece of the puzzle that made no sense. Why would he do this? What did he want from her? The days fell into a strange, unsettling rhythm. Amara took over the household accounts and his correspondence. He treated her not like property, but like a skilled assistant. The work was complex, and he seemed to trust her judgment completely. It felt so normal, so dangerously normal, that she would sometimes forget for a moment how she had come to be there. Then the memory would slam into her, and the fear would return. The first real crack in the mystery came in her second week. Visitors. They arrived after dark, cloaked in shadow, their wagons moving without lanterns. They were families, men, women, and children with haunted, desperate eyes. They would speak with Jedediah in hushed, urgent tones down by the barn, and by sunrise, they would be gone, vanish back into the darkness from which they came. Amara watched from her bedroom window, night after night, as the pattern repeated. Silent arrivals, whispered conversations, departures before dawn. Jedediah never mentioned them, and she was too afraid to ask. Her fear was finally overcome by her curiosity. One evening while he was out, she went to his desk. She found the financial ledgers. The numbers were madness. Huge sums of money were being spent, with no record of what was being purchased. Payments to names she had never heard. It looked less like a business and more like a systematic draining of his own wealth. He was spending a fortune and getting nothing in return. Then, buried in a stack of correspondence, she found it. A letter that blew the whole mystery wide open. It was from a family in Kansas. They thanked Jedediah for his generosity. They wrote of their gratitude for his forgiveness of their debt and for arranging safe passage. Another letter thanked him for buying their farm from the bank at a premium, only to sell it back to them for $1. The pieces slammed together in her mind, forming a picture so impossible, so audacious, that she could barely breathe. That night she didn't wait for him to speak. She confronted him. She stood before the giant of a man, the man who owned her, and she demanded the truth. Her voice didn't tremble. It was the voice of a school teacher, of someone who dealt in facts and would not be denied. Jedediah just looked at her for a long, silent moment. Then he went to his desk, but not to the ledgers. He unlocked a small wooden box she had never seen before. He opened it and laid the contents on the table between them. It was a stack of documents, debt forgiveness papers, signed by dozens of families, bills of sale, and letters, so many letters, from people across 3 territories, all thanking him for their freedom. Jedediah Wyatt was waging a secret war. He was using his massive inheritance to fight a shadow empire of predatory debt. He was buying up the impossible debts from collectors like Granger, and then he was simply forgiving them, wiping them away. The ranch, her new prison, wasn't a prison at all. It was a way station, a stop on an underground railroad for families escaping financial slavery. Amara's mind was reeling. She looked from the papers to his face, and then the final, stunning truth hit her. Her own arrival. The horse. The shameful transaction. It hadn't been a purchase. It had been a rescue. Jedediah knew Granger was coming for her family next. The entire arrangement, the callous trade for the stallion, had been a cover. A brilliant, elaborate disguise to pull her out of Granger's path without raising suspicion. She thought of her childhood, sitting on the steps of the missionary school, listening through the open windows because a black girl wasn't allowed inside. She remembered her fierce, secret determination to learn, to arm herself with knowledge. That knowledge had just become a weapon. Her literacy, her skill with numbers and legal language. All the things she had fought for in secret were the very things Jedediah needed most. She could forge documents with a flawless hand. She could manage the complex web of correspondence. She was not just another mouth to feed or body to protect. She was an asset. She was invaluable. For the first time since her world had crumbled, a genuine smile spread across Amara's face. She wasn't a victim. She wasn't property. She was a soldier who had just found her war. Jedediah watched the transformation on her face. He saw the fear replaced by a fire he recognized, the same fire that had burned in his late wife. "I could use a partner," he said quietly. "Not just an observer." Amara's answer was instant. She had spent a lifetime being judged and underestimated. Now she would turn those prejudices into a shield and her skills into a sword. The real fight, she realized with a surge of exhilaration, was just beginning. 3 days later, she had her first mission. The Washingtons, a family with 4 small children, facing eviction at dawn. Their debt papers were a work of pure evil, a tangle of impossible interest rates designed to multiply until the original loan was a forgotten memory. It was a death sentence on paper. Amara worked through the entire night. The lamplight cast a golden glow on her focused face as her pen flew across the paper. She wasn't just copying words. She was mimicking a life's worth of flourishes and slants. Years spent secretly copying missionary texts had given her an artist's hand. The forgiveness documents she created were not forgeries. They were masterpieces. They were perfect. Jedediah rode out before the sun came up. He returned a few hours later, not with a report, but with the Washingtons themselves. The 4 children stared at the massive ranch house, their eyes wide with a kind of dazed wonder. They had woken up expecting to be homeless, and were now safe. Amara watched them and felt a power surge through her she had never known. With just ink and paper, she had bent reality. She had turned desperation into hope. Their partnership found a rhythm. She was the strategist, the master of documents and details. He was the man of action, handling the logistics, the finances, the dangerous face-to-face meetings. She learned his story in pieces during late-night conversations over maps and ledgers. The fortune was inherited from a banking family back east. His parents had died in a train wreck, leaving him with wealth he never wanted. The work, he explained, was all for his late wife, Sarah. Sarah had been a school teacher, just like Amara. She had been the first person in the territory brave enough to stand up at a town meeting and call Harlan Granger what he was, a thief. She had publicly challenged his practices, naming the families he'd destroyed. 3 days after that meeting, her schoolhouse burned to the ground. She was inside. The law called it an accident. Everyone knew it was a message. Jedediah's grief had not broken him. It had forged him into a weapon. He sold his family's banking interests, moved west, and began his quiet, methodical war. Every family he saved, every debt he forgave, was a stone laid on the monument to his wife's memory. Amara listened, and she understood his pain in a way that startled them both. Her own parents hadn't died in a fire, but they had been killed just as surely. Murdered slowly by the relentless grind of poverty and powerlessness. They were fighting the same monster, just a different face of it. Their shared purpose became a bond stronger than any contract. Respect turned into a deep affection, and affection began to blossom into something more, something neither of them had ever expected. Jedediah never once overstepped. He treated her as a true equal, her voice carrying the same weight as his in every decision. For a woman who had spent her life being dismissed, that respect was more intoxicating than any romance. It was revolutionary. Their success grew. They were a well-oiled machine of liberation. 12 families freed in July, 18 in August. By the fall, they had a whole network of safe houses, using the connections Amara had from her teaching days. But every victory poked the hornet's nest. Granger's profits plummeted. Families he had marked for ruin were suddenly, miraculously, producing legally sound debt forgiveness papers. His bosses, powerful men in the territorial government, started asking questions. The first punch back came in the form of federal marshals. They arrived unannounced, asking pointed questions about forged documents. Jedediah, with his banker's poise, met them with coffee and flawless paperwork. He baffled them with financial jargon and disarmed them with quiet confidence. They left suspecting he was an odd philanthropist, not a revolutionary. Amara watched from the window, her heart pounding. They had dodged the bullet. But the next attack was not so subtle. That night, a rider brought the news. The Miller farm had been burned to the ground. The Millers were a family who had publicly thanked Jedediah for his help. They had escaped with their lives, but just barely. The message was scrawled in ash and smoke. This is what happens to those you save. This is what happens when you fight us. Granger was done with legal maneuvering. He was escalating to open violence. Jedediah was shaken. He saw Sarah's ghost in the smoke from the Miller farm. He wanted to scale back, to be more careful. Amara refused. Her fear had been burned away, replaced by a cold, righteous fury. This was not the time to retreat. This was the time to attack. She laid out a daring new plan. They were vulnerable because they were a single point of failure. The solution? Create more. She proposed recruiting other literate women across the territory. Teachers, shopkeepers' wives, the minister's wife. If there were a dozen forgery operations running at once, Granger couldn't intimidate them all. He couldn't burn every farm. Jedediah argued it was too dangerous, that they would be putting innocent people in the line of fire. But Amara's logic was sharp as a razor. The system won't be changed by timid men, she told him, her voice ringing with a newfound authority. It will be changed by brave women who have nothing left to lose. Their first secret meeting was held in the cold, damp basement of the Methodist Church. 7 women came. Each one had a story, a family member or a friend destroyed by Granger's predatory machine. They saw in Amara not a frightened girl sold for a horse, but a leader. They saw a reflection of their own quiet, burning rage. Within a month, the network was a reality. Their quiet rebellion had become a wildfire. Debt forgiveness papers started appearing in 3 counties at once. Granger's entire operation began to seize up, choked by an invisible, unstoppable resistance. His empire was beginning to crumble. But empires do not fall quietly. The federal pressure intensified. It was clear to the powers that be that this was no longer random acts of charity. This was an organized, systematic attack. Granger's violence became more targeted. People known to be sympathetic to Jedediah started receiving threats. Their barns were vandalized, their wells were poisoned. Amara knew they were missing something. The scale of the pushback was too big, too coordinated for just one man like Granger. She started digging, using the ranch's library as her arsenal. She spent weeks poring over federal land office documents, legal precedents, territorial records. She started noticing patterns, a signature that appeared on land seizure documents in Oklahoma, and then again on papers in Kansas. Identical phrasing in legal filings from completely different counties. It was a ghost network, hidden in plain sight within the bureaucracy. Late one night, fueled by coffee and sheer determination, she found it. The smoking gun. It was a letter, tucked away in a file of routine correspondence. A letter from the territorial governor to Judge Morrison. It explicitly laid out a plan to coordinate debt collection policies with federal land officials to seize specific parcels of land owned by Black and Native families. Granger wasn't the mastermind. He was just the muscle. This was a criminal conspiracy, a syndicate of federal judges, land office bureaucrats, and even the governor himself, all working together. They were using the law as a weapon to systematically steal land, then selling it to the railroads and mining companies for kickbacks. The profits weren't just lining Granger's pockets. They were being split among the most powerful men in the territory. The revelation landed like a physical blow. Amara felt the air rush out of her lungs. They weren't fighting a corrupt debt collector. They were fighting the United States government. She ran to find Jedediah. She spread the documents across his desk, the pieces of the puzzle falling into place, revealing a picture of pure, absolute evil. Their small, righteous rebellion had just stumbled out of the dark woods and onto a battlefield, facing an army they never even knew existed. 3 days after Amara's discovery, the army arrived. Federal marshals. They swarmed the ranch at dawn, their wagons kicking up clouds of dust that blotted out the rising sun. They carried warrants signed by Judge Morrison himself, the very man at the heart of the conspiracy. The charges were a laundry list of federal crimes: document fraud, conspiracy to defraud the government, interference with lawful debt collection. Jedediah met them on the porch. He was impossibly calm, offering them coffee as if they were welcome guests. He answered their questions with a steady, patient voice, but Amara saw the tension in his shoulders, the tightness around his eyes. The marshals tore the house apart. They emptied drawers, overturned furniture, ripped books from the shelves in the library, but they found nothing. The night before, Amara and Jedediah had worked in frantic silence, moving every single incriminating document: the debt forgiveness papers, the letters, the governor's correspondence. It was all now hidden beneath the floorboards of the Methodist Church, safe from prying eyes. The marshals left empty-handed, but they had delivered their message. The conspiracy was shielded by federal power. They had unlimited resources, and they were coming for them. That same day, the real attack began. It was brutal and swift. Word came that 3 of the families they had rescued were dragged from their homes, not by marshals with warrants, but by Granger's thugs. The Washingtons, the very first family Amara had saved, were forced to watch as their fields were set ablaze, their year's harvest turning to black smoke. Retaliation was merciless. The network of safe houses they had built collapsed overnight. Fear spread faster than the fires. The brave women who had joined their cause sent frantic messages, withdrawing their support. They had their own families to protect. Who could blame them? The rebellion was over. Terror had won. Jedediah paced the house like a caged lion. His calm had finally shattered. For months, his careful planning had kept them safe. But this was a new enemy, an enemy who wore the shield of the law while wielding the sword of a criminal. They were outmaneuvered, outgunned, and utterly alone. Amara refused to surrender. She laid out the stolen documents on the desk again, the proof of the conspiracy. "This is our weapon," she insisted. "If we can get this to honest officials in Washington, we can destroy them." Jedediah's response was a bitter pill. "There are no honest officials," he said, his voice raw with despair. "Don't you see? The rot goes all the way to the top. We can't win this fight. We can only run." He told her his plan. He had contacts, old banking associates who could get her to California. A new name, a new life. He would stay behind. He would take the fall for everything, claiming he had coerced her, that she was just an unwilling pawn. He would protect her. The words were meant to be a comfort, but they felt like an insult. The suggestion ignited a fury in Amar that burned hotter than any fire Granger could set. Had he learned nothing about her? She had spent her entire life having her fate decided by others. Her uncle's desperation. This very arrangement. She would die before she let another man, even a man she was beginning to love, send her away to be safe. They had their first real fight. His desperation to protect her clashed with her iron will to see this through. He had already lost one woman he loved to this war. The thought of losing Amara, of seeing Sarah's fate repeated, was a terror that drove him mad. But for Amara, this was about more than personal safety. It was about every family they had saved, every person who had dared to hope. To run now would be to betray them all, to admit that the Grangers and the Morrisons of the world would always win. The argument raged through the night, a storm of grief and fear and stubborn pride, until they were left in an exhausted, silent stalemate in the library, surrounded by the books that had taught them both to believe in a justice that now seemed like a child's fairy tale. Dawn did not bring a resolution, it brought the end. More federal marshals arrived. This time they didn't have warrants for their arrest. They had a seizure order. Under asset forfeiture laws, all of Jedediah Wyatt's property was to be confiscated and sold at auction to compensate the victims of his fraud. It was a move of breathtaking cynicism. By twisting their act of liberation into a crime, the government was not only crushing them, but also profiting from it. From her upstairs window, Amara watched them tag everything: the cattle, the furniture, the books in the library. In the yard, a marshal tied an auction tag to the bridle of the magnificent stallion, the horse that had been her price. Everything they had built, everything they had fought with, was being dismantled piece by piece. And then that afternoon, the final crushing blow. A writer brought news from town. Judge Morrison had issued federal warrants for the arrest of every single woman in their network. The minister's wife, the elderly Mrs. Patterson, who had only helped with copying, all of them branded as federal criminals, facing years in prison. Jedediah slumped into his chair, a broken man. They hadn't just lost. They had led dozens of good people to their doom. But as Amara watched the marshals catalog their defeat, her analytical mind, the mind that could spot a forged signature from 10 paces, saw something else. She saw their enemy's weakness. They had overwhelming power, yes, but that power depended on darkness. Their conspiracy could only function as long as it remained hidden in the shadows of legal jargon and backroom deals. The one thing they could not withstand was the light. She turned to Jedediah, her eyes blazing with a terrifying, brilliant idea. They had one move left, one final, desperate gambit. Instead of running from federal authority, they would charge directly at it. They would drag the entire conspiracy out of the shadows and put it on trial. Not in a courtroom run by a corrupt judge, but in the court of public opinion. She proposed a town meeting, a public forum where they would present their evidence to every citizen in the territory. Jedediah stared at her, his face a mask of disbelief. It was the most insane idea he had ever heard. It wasn't a gambit, it was suicide. She was proposing they walk into a den of wolves and try to reason with them. But in her eyes, he didn't see insanity. He saw the same unshakable conviction that Sarah had possessed. It was a choice between a certain, slow death in the shadows or one last, glorious fight in the sun. The plan was forged in the fire of 3 sleepless nights. It was a tightrope walk over a canyon, where a single misstep meant a fatal fall for everyone. Amara's idea was simple in its audacity. Call a public town meeting to discuss the federal charges. It would look like a community trying to understand the law. In reality, it would be an ambush. She would not be the defendant. She would be the prosecutor. First, the evidence. It had to be undeniable. Amara worked like a woman possessed, copying the key documents. She organized them not as a legal case, but as a story of theft, corruption, and murder told through the government's own paperwork. Jedediah, his hope rekindled by her fire, used his banking knowledge to create charts that followed the money. He traced the path of stolen land from a family's farm through a fraudulent auction and into the hands of a railroad or mining company, with kickbacks flowing back to Judge Morrison and the governor. It was a detailed, damning map of their crimes. But paper and charts were not enough. They needed voices. They needed witnesses. This was the most dangerous part. Amara began to secretly contact the families they had helped. She didn't offer them safety or promise them victory. She offered them a chance to fight back. Many were too terrified. They had already lost too much. But some were filled with the same righteous anger that fueled her. To everyone's surprise, the first to volunteer was elderly Mrs. Patterson. The widow whose farm had been stolen before Jedediah saved it was frail, but her spirit was iron. "They have already taken everything from me once," she said, her voice thin but steady. "I have nothing left to fear." Her courage was contagious. The Methodist minister, a man who had seen his congregation torn apart by debt, agreed to host the meeting in his church. The federal marshals paid him a visit, warning him about harboring fugitives. He showed them the door. Word of the meeting spread not by posters or announcements, but through the same underground network they had used for their rescues. A whisper from a shopkeeper, a quiet word from a former student. The news traveled on the wind, reaching families in distant counties who had suffered the same fate. Of course, Granger found out. He rode into town with a dozen hired guns, his face a thundercloud. He demanded the local sheriff shut down the meeting. When the sheriff hesitated, Granger's men made their presence known, swaggering through the streets, their hands never far from their pistols. Several families who had promised to testify quietly packed their wagons and left town. The corrupt federal marshals loyal to Morrison followed, armed with legal threats. Unlawful assembly, they called it. Conspiracy. They warned that anyone who even attended the meeting would be considered an accomplice. The intimidation worked. Attendance was expected to be cut in half, but it also backfired. It showed how desperate and afraid their enemies were. Amara seized on this. She sent out a new message. If these officials are innocent, why do they fear a public discussion? The guilty are the only ones who fear the light. The logic was simple and powerful. It resonated with the deep-seated distrust people had for an authority that operated in secret and demanded blind obedience. Then, 3 days before the meeting, came a twist neither of them could have predicted. A lone rider came to the ranch. He introduced himself as Marshal Davis from the territorial capital. He was not one of Morrison's men. His face was weary, his eyes honest. He asked to speak with Jedediah alone. Davis was an internal affairs investigator. He told Jedediah that honest officials back in Washington had been tracking a pattern of suspicious land seizures in the territories for months. They knew something was rotten, but they had no witnesses, no inside source. They had been building a case in secret, but they needed someone on the ground to break it open. The news was a bombshell. They weren't alone after all. Davis urged them to cancel the meeting, to work with him in secret. He warned them that the conspiracy was powerful and a public move was too risky. It could get them all killed before a case could be made. But Amara refused. The community had been terrorized in public. They deserved to see justice in public. More than that, she knew that the public nature of the meeting was their only shield. The conspiracy could make witnesses disappear in the dead of night. They couldn't make an entire town disappear in broad daylight. Davis, seeing her determination, made a decision. He would attend the meeting, not to stop it, but to be an official federal witness to it. He would provide protection, and he would take official statements. His presence would lend them the legitimacy they desperately needed. The final days were a blur of frantic preparation. Amara rehearsed her presentation until the words were a part of her, a weapon she could wield with deadly precision. Jedediah organized a defense force of ranch hands and community volunteers. They couldn't win a gunfight against Granger's men, but they could create a human wall around the church. The night before the meeting, Amara stood alone in the dark, silent sanctuary. The weight of what they were about to do pressed down on her. Tomorrow, everything would be decided. Their fight, their freedom, the fate of hundreds of families. It all came down to this one moment. It would either be their salvation or their execution. The church was packed. They came from all over the territory, a sea of anxious, hopeful, and terrified faces. Every pew was full, people standing in the aisles, crowding the doorway, their presence a silent act of mass defiance. Granger and his thugs arrived, positioning themselves near the exits, a blatant act of intimidation. The corrupt federal marshals flanked the entrance, their arms crossed, their expressions grim. It was a room simmering with tension, a powder keg waiting for a spark. But then Marshal Davis walked in. He didn't come alone. He had a federal stenographer with him. They took a seat right in the front row, in full view of everyone. Davis placed his notepad and pen on the pew in front of him. The message was unmistakable. Everything that happens here is now in the official record of the United States government. The air in the room shifted. The balance of power had just changed. Amara walked to the pulpit. The stack of documents in her hands felt as heavy as a gravestone. The hands that had trembled so violently when she first arrived at the ranch were now steady. She looked out at the crowd, meeting their eyes. She saw fear, but she also saw hope. She saw herself. She began, not with accusations, but with the law. Her voice, clear and strong, filled the sanctuary. She read from the federal lending acts, explaining in simple terms the difference between legal debt collection and criminal theft. For many in the room, it was the first time they understood that they hadn't just been unlucky, they had been robbed. You could feel the understanding ripple through the crowd, a murmur of shared anger. Then she moved to the conspiracy. She held up the documents one by one. "Here is Judge Morrison's signature on a land seizure in Oklahoma," she said, her voice ringing with authority. "And here it is again, on a seizure in Kansas. Two different families, two different states, one crooked judge." Granger shot to his feet, his face purple with rage. He bellowed that the meeting was illegal, that she was under arrest. His men took a step forward. But before they could take another, Marshal Davis stood up. "I am a federal investigator," he announced, his voice cutting through the tension, And this young woman is providing testimony in an official federal investigation. Interfere with her, and you will be charged with obstruction of justice. Granger froze. His authority, which was based entirely on fear and the illusion of federal backing, had just evaporated. He was exposed, a bully without his shield. He sat back down, his face a mask of fury. That's when Mrs. Patterson slowly got to her feet. Her voice was frail, but every person in the church leaned in to hear her. She told her story, holding up her own doctored loan papers, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of the injustice. Her testimony broke the dam. One by one, others stood up. The Washingtons, the Millers, who spoke of the fire, a dozen others, a chorus of the oppressed, their individual stories weaving together into an undeniable testament of systematic corruption. They spoke of stolen land, hungry children, and broken families, all to enrich a cabal of powerful men. As the last testimony finished, Amara presented her final, most devastating evidence, Jedediah's charts. She unrolled them, showing the flow of money, connecting the stolen farms directly to the pockets of the governor and his cronies. The vast criminal enterprise was laid bare for all to see. At that exact moment, the church doors burst open. Judge Morrison himself stormed in, flanked by his own marshals. He held up a fistful of warrants. "This illegal assembly is over," he roared. "Amara Jackson, Jedediah Wyatt, you are under arrest for conspiracy against the United States government." But Marshal Davis simply stepped into the aisle, blocking his path, and he held up a warrant of his own. "Judge Morrison," Davis said, his voice cold as steel, "you are under arrest by order of the Attorney General of the United States." The church erupted. The sound was a tidal wave of shock, relief, and pure, unadulterated joy. For years, these people had lived in fear of Morrison and his cronies. Now they were watching their oppressor being led away in chains by honest lawmen. Granger made a break for the side door, but he didn't get far. The crowd, no longer afraid, surged forward. They didn't lay a hand on him, but they formed a silent, impassable wall of human bodies, trapping him until one of Davis's men could cuff him. The bully was a coward, after all. The aftermath was swift and decisive. With the conspiracy's leaders under arrest, the entire rotten structure collapsed. The trials in Washington were a national scandal. Dozens of officials, from the governor down to the local land agents, were sentenced to prison. Every fraudulent debt was voided by federal court order. The stolen lands were returned to their rightful owners, with compensation for their losses. Justice, for once, was not just a word in a book. It was real. Amara and Jedediah's partnership became something more. The ranch was no longer a fortress, but a school, a place where Amara taught people how to read, not just books, but contracts. She taught them their rights, arming them with the knowledge to protect themselves. Their arrangement, born of desperation, had transformed into a marriage of true equals. Their love had been forged in the crucible of their fight for justice. A year later, Amara stood in her new schoolhouse, built on the ranch. It was filled with the children of the families they had saved, children whose futures were no longer limited by debt and fear. Outside the window, the magnificent stallion grazed peacefully in a pasture owned by a community that had found its strength. The single transaction that was supposed to be the end of her freedom had become the beginning of liberation for thousands. A girl who was told she was worth less than a horse had proven that one voice, armed with courage and the truth, could bring an empire to its knees. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to like and subscribe for more tales of justice and redemption.